All right, folks, now I want to take a little bit of time to talk about compulsion-based training. Now, it comes with a myriad of names. Just like positive reinforcement, compulsion training comes under some different names. We'll go through them now. Compulsion, crank and yank, escape and avoidance, and also known as old school training methods. There might be some other names, but those are the main ones you hear about. Let me just tell you a little bit what it is so you can kind of wrap your head around it. In short, it is teaching a dog that they have to do something. If they don't do it, pressure will come on, pressure will stay on until the exercise is complete. And that's where we get into why they call it maybe escape and avoidance, which we'll cover in just a minute. But where can you find old school trainers? Well, trust me, they're here, there, and everywhere. They're not as prevalent as positive only trainers, but a hallmark or a telltale sign that you're dealing with a compulsion style trainer is they will not use food, they will not use treats. Now, they won't advertise that, but you will definitely see that they're cranking dogs out in those 2-week board and trains. There is no way on God's green earth that you can use any type of positive training or balance training and get a dog finished training in 2 weeks' time. So when you see a 2-week board and train, it's a compulsion trainer. Now, that doesn't mean it's bad. There's pros and cons to it, but I want you to decide for yourself what you think about old school training. And we're going to dive in deep and give you, again, all the pros, all the cons, so you can make a decision for yourself. Now, escape and avoidance training, using that moniker makes the most sense because we can describe it in those two instances. Either we teach the dog to escape pressure or we teach it to avoid the pressure altogether. So I'll give you an example. If I put a leash and a collar on a dog and I use the leash and I apply, let's say, forward pressure. I'm applying that forward pressure, and almost every dog on the planet is not going to like that forward pressure. They're going to be tapping into something called opposition reflex. We'll talk about that some other time. But in other words, you're going to apply forward pressure, and the dog's going to be like, this is uncomfortable. And the only way to turn off or escape that pressure is to go with the pressure and go into their crate, go onto a place board, maybe lifting them into a sit or pulling them into a down. You put pressure on, you keep pressure on until the dog makes their own decision to escape that pressure. Now that we've given some examples on the escape aspect of escape and avoidance training, let's talk about the avoidance aspect and give a couple of examples. So the first one that comes to mind is you open your front door and the dog goes to shoot out into the street. But if you have a leash hooked up to that dog and you're holding it tight, and the dog runs to the end of the leash and runs out of leash, it will implement its own self-correction, meaning it runs out of leash, it doesn't feel good, ouch, and it thinks to itself, like, what caused that? It was uncomfortable. I ran to the end of the leash. I probably shouldn't have done that because it didn't feel good. The next time that door opens, the dog's going to go, I'm probably not going to run out this time. I see you holding the leash. I'm going to avoid that correction that happened. Beautiful example of avoiding the correction altogether, and therefore stopping the bad behavior, by the way. Let me give you 2 more examples. What about a dog that is jumping up on people or jumping up on the counter? If it goes to jump up on the counter and it gets a high-level e-collar or it gets a pop on the leash, it's going to say, when I jump on the counter, it doesn't feel good. In other words, I'm going to avoid that. I'll give you a human example real quick. If there's a hot stove and you didn't know it was hot and you accidentally reached over and touched it, you're going to burn yourself, and you, in the future, are going to avoid touching a hot stove, meaning you learned through your own devices. No one was yelling at you, no one was screaming at you, no one popped you with a leash. You learned that touching hot stoves does not pay, and so you're going to avoid doing that in the future. One more example of how you can use avoidance to bring about amazing reliability and duration in your training would be holding a position. So whether that's a dog on a place board, a dog in a crate but with the door open, heel position, a sit, a down, you name it. We've taught the dog to hold that position because if they break the position, then pressure comes on. If you don't like the pressure and you want to avoid that, then maintain the position. As long as you maintain the position, you will avoid the pressure. And that's kind of it in a nutshell, what escape and avoidance or compulsion training is. It's a style of training where you're simply putting pressure on and taking pressure away to help shape behaviors. Now, let's dive into the pros and cons of this. You can already see what some of the pros and cons are, possibly, but let's just dive in a little deeper and really illuminate all of them for you. So the first big pro of this type of training is that it requires no food, no treats, no toys, meaning you don't need to walk around with food and treats and toys on you 24/7 to get the reliability you need. The other added benefit is, what if you have a dog that has little to no food, treat, or toy drive to begin with? These types of dogs not only excel in compulsion style training, but it's a necessity, because if you have a dog that's just simply not motivated by food, or your certain behaviors present themselves, whether it's fear-based aggression or some type of dominance or other type of aggression, you can't use food anyways because the food drive is completely shut off at that point in time. Maybe even in a high state of prey drive, the food drive is completely shut off, and so you are running out of alternatives, and the only alternative available to you would be old school training or compulsion-based training. So again, to recap, dogs with little to no food drive, you can use compulsion training, and also it's a great way to maintain, reinforce the training you already have when you don't have a food, treat, or toy on you to combat or to go against whatever distraction might be present. Meaning you ask your dog to sit and they don't sit, and you don't have a food, treat, or toy to bribe them, you now have a way, potentially through leash pressure, to demand the sit and get the sit that you asked for. So I'm going to touch on one more pro, which is reliability. Nothing brings about reliability more than compulsion style training. I'm not saying it's the best thing on the planet as an isolated training, but you cannot argue that it brings about reliability, because let's just use that example. If your dog is attached to a leash and it shoots out the front door to chase after God knows what, if you're holding strongly on the leash and you have the proper collar on the dog, simply put, your dog can't run out the front door. It just can't. It can only go so far. Let's add it a little further. What if you have your dog on some type of leash? You call it a flexi leash, a long line 30-foot leash, 6-foot leash, you name it, and your dog fails to come to you. You can literally use the leash to reel them back in. You cannot beat the reliability of having a leash on a dog. Now, we're going a little ahead of ourselves here, but if you do proper e-collar training, and e-collar is just a digital leash. It's a way to reach out and touch your dog at distances beyond 1, 2, 3, 400 yards or 400 meters or more, and you can get your dog to come back reliably, again, with proper training, but it brings about incredible reliability. We talked about it a little bit earlier, but another pro of compulsion style training is the ability to get duration. There is no other way to get duration as fast, clean, efficient, and reliably as putting a little bit of compulsion or a little bit of avoidance, meaning you must hold that position or else. Once the dog understands there is an or else, they are much more likely to maintain a position, especially, and we'll talk about it later, when you combine it with food rewards. So there's like this yin and yang, but stay tuned for that. We're going to be there in just a minute. And last but not least, the biggest pro of compulsion style training is it is exactly what is needed to stop bad behaviors. Point blank, period. If you do something bad, a correction will come, swift and severe. If you don't like it, stop doing it. It's as simple as that. We go back to the example of touching a hot stove. How many times you need to touch a 400-degree oven to realize it's not in your best interest to keep doing that? And if you apply that same thought process on really, really bad behaviors, jumping, barking, biting, chewing on furniture, peeing in your house, you name it, those really, really bad behaviors that we've already discussed cannot be fixed with treats and treats alone. We now have a way to literally stop that bad behavior and start chipping away at it and stop it once and for all and for good. That is one of the biggest pros of compulsion style training when used correctly. Now that we've covered the pros with compulsion style training, there is a list of cons that we have to address. There's no avoiding it, there's no hiding. This is the problem with going compulsion only style training, old school training, crank and yank, escape and avoidance, whatever you want to call it. There's a list of cons. We're going to dive into those right now. The first con that becomes immediately apparent that any professional dog trainer can see almost instantly, even you now that I've talked about it, when you start looking around and you're shopping for a trainer, I want you to watch and see the behavior of the dogs that have been trained. If the dog looks very flat, it's very likely that dog was trained compulsion style. What is flat? Like they're walking on a leash, but they don't look very happy to be there. They're just kind of like Eeyore. They're moping about. The dog is told to sit or down, and they sit and they down, but they like think about it, and then they do it kind of like, It's this like 3 to 5 second down, this 3 to 5 second sit. They recall, but not in a hurry. Very flat. Well, what we typically say is compulsion style training brings a dog that's very flat, but reliable. Now, there is a term in the dog training industry that we refer to as flattening a dog out. Now, what do I mean by that? Whether it's your dog that just gets way too excited when the doorbell rings, your dog that gets way too excited when it sees another dog or kids or someone oogie boo boo baby talks them and that motor is through the roof. Or it's a police dog that is just at an 11 out of 10 trying to bite a bad guy. We need to come in with a way to kind of slow that motor down and maybe flatten them out a little bit to get a little bit more reliability. I think of it this way. If you're driving a car and you need to make a right-hand turn, but you're going 100 miles an hour, you need to be able to pump the brakes and slow the car down so you can negotiate that right-hand turn. If you have a dog going full speed chasing after something and you need them to stop, slow down, and turn around, we need to find a way to pump the brakes, flatten them out, calm them down a little bit. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's only a bad thing when it's done to the extreme and we take all the joy and excitement and fun out of training to begin with and the dog is just flat all across the board. But again, we do find clients that's all they're hoping for is, man, can you make my dog more manageable? Can you, quote, calm them down? When we're talking about calming a dog down, we are talking about typically flattening a dog out and introducing a little bit of impulse control for the given situation. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I just want you to know that with every pro, there's a con. With every con, there might be a pro attached to it. And so it's pros and cons, but they kind of bleed together sometimes. Let's move on to one of the next cons. One of the cons of compulsion style training is the fact that it leaves what we call a net zero gain with your dog. Don't get too confused, not too much math. But let me just say that your dog is just at a zero, right? It's just hanging out. Nothing good or bad is happening. But you put pressure on the dog, maybe leash pressure. That leash pressure is uncomfortable for the dog. So as soon as it feels it, it goes from neutral or a 0 to like a -1. And he goes, man, this is uncomfortable. I don't like this. What can I do to turn this off? Hopefully you're there to guide it. Let it go into the crate or onto the place board or into the position of your choosing, a sit or a down. And as soon as it does that, you turn off the pressure. Now, as soon as you turn off the pressure, it goes from a -1 back to a 0 because it's like, that pressure went away. I feel much better now. And so it's just this net zero gain. Pressure comes on, pressure goes away, but there's nothing gained. This will be expanded upon more in the next section when we talk about balance training, how you can walk away with a net positive and the dog is happy to be there. But one more way to put it is that compulsion style training, it's like a lot of work but no pay. Imagine going to work every day and the only reason you're working is just to avoid your boss breathing down your neck or giving you a hard time. You're avoiding that pressure or trying to escape it at all costs. But no matter how good of a job you do, you don't get paid. There's no payday. That's one of the issues with compulsion training. We've kind of talked about this already, and it's under the idea of being flat, but we will find the dog has little to no motivation to perform the desired command. They do it, but with no speed, no enthusiasm, no excitement. And so if you're trying to train a competition dog that looks beautiful on the field, you're going to do a lot less compulsion style training, or you're only going to add in compulsion just a little bit at the end to kind of trim off the excess, right? So the dog's not too extra, that you have a lot of horsepower, you have a lot of speed and excitement, but it's not so much excitement that it spills over and the dog is becoming disobedient, that the dog recalls, but it recalls so fast that it blows 50 feet behind you before it turns around, right? So a beautiful example of when you could use a little compulsion to kind of cap that level of excitement. In fact, what we call sometimes capping a drive. And last but not least, when compulsion training is done incorrectly, which a lot of the times it is done incorrectly because it's not in balance with other training methods, it can make the dog just really not like training. Again, it takes all the fun out of it, and it can be a stressful experience for your dog, right? And I give you the perfect example. You send your dog off to a board and train program, one of those McDonald's of dog training programs, and it's a 2-week crank and yank special. The dog is going to be asked to do things it doesn't even know how to do. It doesn't know how to sit, it doesn't know how to down, and it definitely doesn't know how to heel, and maybe it's never recalled before in its life. And with the compulsion style training, especially when they squeeze it in 2 weeks, I can't stand it because they're forcing dogs to do things they don't understand. In other words, the dog learns kind of like trial by fire. If you make a mistake, I know you don't even know what you're doing anyways, you're going to feel the pressure. If you don't like the pressure, you need to learn faster. And so you can fast track a dog through it. It's not my cup of tea. It's not for me. It does work. Again, it can be reliable, but it flattens dogs out way too much for me, and I don't think it's a fair way to train. And so if you were to ask me, now that you've heard about these two options, Garrett, I got a positive only trainer that lives down the street, I got a compulsion trainer that lives the next block over, who should I go with? If you were a friend of mine or a family member and you only have these two options, I would typically push you towards the compulsion style trainer. Yes, your dog will be more flat. Yes, it'll be more stressful, but your dog will be reliable and it works in the real world. However, there's a third option that's becoming more and more prevalent. And you don't need to pick just between option 1 or option 2. You can get best of both worlds. And that leads us into the next section, which is balance training. And simply put, it is the best of both worlds combined. But we're going to dive in a little deeper so that you can really wrap your head around why balance training works and why it is the number one way, point blank period, there ain't even a question about it, that balance training is the one and only way that you should be training your dog.